Okay. Today is March 25th, 2021. I am Daniel Erickson, and today I'm interviewing Dr. Bill Hagen over Zoom about Oklahoma Humanities and his interactions with the organization as a part of Oklahoma Humanities' 50th anniversary project. So thank you for joining me today.
I'm happy to.
Yeah. And so to get started, just tell me a little bit about yourself.
All right. I taught for 38 years at Oklahoma Baptist University with degrees from Davidson College, University of North Carolina, and a PhD from the University of Iowa. My main areas of concentration were modern novel, particularly Joseph Conrad, Malcolm Lowry, and I developed a specialty in film adaptation, wrote several articles on that subject. And most of the time at OBU, I was part of the liberal arts program teaching Western Civ in a team teaching situation with a historian. And we put the students through a sequence that begins with the Greeks in their freshman year and then goes all the way to present in the sophomore year. And that was probably the major part of my load, and in some ways the most satisfying part of my load, apart from some of the specialized things. I got into Let's Talk About It, if you want to go there, in the mid 80s when I think that's about when it began in Oklahoma. It started with possibly I was in the first outing of it in a series called Not Just for Children, which we mounted at the Shawnee Library. And I've been active in it since then. And I'm not sure how many programs I've done. I think at one anniversary, I was given some sort of award for doing over 100, something like 150. So I'm probably up to about 200 or more at this point. Someone knows, I don't, how many I've done. I end up doing about, at the top, 6 programs each half year, spring and fall. So total of 12. And I've traveled all over the state doing it and don't mind the drive. In fact, I rather like to drive and discover small towns. And usually I spend part of my honorarium on the best restaurant in town. And that in itself has been a real treat. And then to meet folks across the state, do the programs, usually to people that have all read the book, which is not always the case in the classroom, as you probably know. So we have good discussions.
Yeah, that's all great. Yeah, so moving on, why don't you tell me a bit about your experience growing up and your early education up through high school?
Okay. I grew up in the suburb. Well, I guess to start at the beginning. Till about age 12, I grew up near Portland, Oregon, and my father worked for the Department of Interior. He was a salmon biologist, and so we were moved to the suburbs of Washington, D.C. about age 12. And I grew up in Falls Church, Virginia, inside the Beltway, which didn't exist when we moved there. I guess from a fairly early age, I liked to work just to earn extra money. And so I was a paper boy all the way up through my teen years, delivering the Evening Star, which no longer exists, sometimes the Washington Post. And then in high school, I should say, I got pretty much in the habit of going to the library quite a bit. My parents encouraged reading. The expectation in our family was that we would at least attain the education of our parents and maybe more. And in both places we moved to, the library was quite close. I could get there. I lucked out in the sense that I had to have orthodontics, that middle class, you got to get your teeth straight. And the only orthodontist was in downtown Washington, D.C. So once a month I would go there, and I would go to the Central Library. I think it's probably the first Carnegie library that was built, and discovered authors I had not discovered before, was able to check out books there, as well as go to bookstores and a magazine store where I could buy Mad Magazine, which was not that available in the suburbs at the time. So at any rate, I grew up in a house that we had our set of encyclopedias. I think it was Britannica Junior, and we were encouraged to read. We were encouraged to do well in school. I did well mostly, not always. And we were encouraged to take the hard courses. So in my case, for instance, even though I ended up as an English major in college, I took all three sciences. I think my dad wanted me to become a biologist or something like that, and as well as Latin and typing. That's sort of my background, and I went to a small liberal arts college, Davidson College in North Carolina, most famous for graduating Steph Curry, who was somehow passed over by Duke and University of North Carolina basketball programs, and got a very good education there. It is so much a liberal arts college that they don't even have professional programs. You can't even get an education degree from there. So basically you major in one of the main subjects. Got a good education there, and in part I didn't quite know what else to do, so I went on to graduate school. Just seemed natural. I enjoyed it. University of North Carolina, and got an English degree from there. Taught 2 years at upon graduation there at East Carolina College, which is now East Carolina University, and then a couple years at Wake Forest University, and then went to the University of Iowa to get my PhD, and from there got the job at Oklahoma Baptist, where I've remained. Didn't think I'd end up in Oklahoma, but it's grown on me considerably. And I bristle when any of my East Coast friends make disparaging remarks about living out here in the flatlands. They don't understand, basically.
Yeah. So when you went to Davidson College for undergrad, what was it that you majored in?
I majored in English, yeah.
Okay.
And yeah, I was fairly active in writing and so forth, and became editor of the newspaper eventually. In fact, probably the crossroads in my career had to do with the fact that I had been accepted to the University of North Carolina, and then I was offered a scholarship to Columbia Journalism School, and that was a tough one. I was on the phone. At the time, I was working as a summer intern for the Richmond News Leader, and I thought about it. I had to answer over the phone, which is kind of interesting, and decided I'd rather go on in English. Probably the biggest factor was that I would have to turn in stories almost as quickly as I wrote them, and I do like to polish, and I do like to mess with the language, and that sort of determined me that I'd go to a career where one had the opportunity to sort of work on things better. And at any rate, since retirement, interestingly, I now write a monthly column for the local newspaper, just on whatever I want to write about. And so I've sort of returned to journalism, you might say, and really enjoy writing without having to do all the research and the somewhat convoluted language of my academic specialty. Uh, Even though I, end up talking about movies and books and that kind of thing as well.
Yeah. No. What is it about English as a subject that drew you to it?
Hmm. I guess the imaginative journey, the attempt to create a world within the book, to draw the reader in, um, the exploration of psychology. I was almost a psych major, but at the time, at Davidson at least, and this would be in the late 50s, early 60s, stimulus response was the approach that was favored, which is to say you're looking at rats going around mazes and trying to condition them in one way or another. And the abnormal course was good, but at any rate, it wasn't enough human-centered for me, and English seemed to offer that opportunity. Also, I like to write, and just the engagement with a text or trying to create a text, an essay, a short story, a poem, uh, engage me. And I think in some ways reading and English help make one a better person, in the sense that you have to imaginatively enter uh, other people's minds and other people's worlds. And so I see it as a healthy and maybe even necessary kind of engagement to develop, to develop tolerance and civic discourse and other good things that democracy is supposed to be founded on.
Yeah, for sure. Uh, and so when you went to grad school,
Mm-hmm.
was there a specific, topic that you focused on in your studies?
Uh, well, I'll have to admit a big mistake I made. At Davidson, you could major, and then you were pretty much free to take other courses. And I spread myself around quite a bit. Having grown up in the Washington area um, and reading the Washington newspapers regularly, um, I was fascinated somewhat by politics. And so I imagine, and I'd taken a number of political and economic courses at Davidson. So I imagine that maybe a master's which would bridge two departments, English and political science, might be possible. Alas, it was not. I found myself way over my head in political science, which was very quantitative at the time. They were very much into data crunching and everything else. Um, and so I got out of that after one semester and went into English. And I was mainly interested in the novel, fiction, pretty much. And so took courses that, particularly from the 18th century on, when the novel develops, and wrote a thesis on combining the interests of two writers, D.H. Lawrence and his friend, although he's opposite in many ways, Aldous Huxley, most famous for Brave New World, of course. Huxley, in a novel called Point Counterpoint, creates a Lorentzian type of figure, someone representing D.H. Lawrence. And that kind of fascinated me. So I was working with what Lawrence had done in Women in Love, which is probably his best novel, and then the influence that he might have had on Huxley, who was really more known for being a hidebound intellectual. You read his essays, and they're just fascinating. Huxley carried around a complete set of Encyclopedia Britannica when he when he traveled, by the way. Uh, so that's, I ended up being in sort of modern English fiction, and had interests in Joyce and Woolf, the moderns, basically, among the novelists. Um, Only later, when I went to the University of Iowa, did I develop much more interest in the post-war group, because Iowa has the writers' workshop, and people like Vonnegut and John Barth would come through, and you'd hear them and get all excited about their books and so forth, and read them. And there were a lot of aspiring writers there who later developed into rather prominent writers as well. So even though I ended up writing my dissertation on, again, two writers, Malcolm Lowry, who wrote Under the Volcano, and Joseph Conrad's book about a South American political situation called Nostromo. So I'm staying in the, you might say, the modern British tradition. But at the same time, I was taught a course in contemporary fiction, contemporary American fiction, with Pynchon and John Barth and Robert Coover, Samuel Beckett even. That was a tough one. And and others. That Beckett, not that Beckett's tough. His novels are pretty dense, actually. But at any rate, so I gravitated to that, and both at Wake Forest, when I taught there for a couple of years, and earlier at Davidson, we'd had lively film programs, particularly in the 60s. You had the French New Wave people, Truffaut, and people like the Godard, and people like that, Ingmar Bergman, films coming in. And it was a very exciting time. People sort of discovered film as an art, you might say. And so I ended up becoming very interested in adaptations, and wrote probably my best articles. A couple of them were on the Heart of Darkness connection to Apocalypse Now. And they were collected in various book publications that were published. And so I got interested in that area as well. And ended up going to conferences and, delivering papers, and then some of the papers would be turned into articles along that line.
Yeah. Then, yeah, I guess could you just tell me a little bit about your time as a professor at Oklahoma Baptist University?
Okay. Well, half my load, actually 3/4 of my load, a 12-hour load, would be with the basic courses, freshman composition, a freshman introduction to literature, which would feature the Greeks. So I read the Odyssey every year and inflicted it upon generations of students while I was doing that. And then Western Civ, which would be a 12-hour, well, excuse me, it would be a 6-hour commitment, because we would meet for 2 hours, 3 days a week, or every day in the week, because the students got double credit for that, history and English. And so that became a major part of my load. And then I would be teaching a film adaptation course, a course in popular culture sometimes, survey of English literature occasionally, sometimes American literature. It's a small school, small department, so you'd end up with a variety of assignments at times, sometimes literary criticism. And then we had a J term, or January term, when we were encouraged to teach experimental things. And so I taught some outdoor kinds of things, and we did a backpacking trip to Big Bend, for instance, at one point. And then in the European study thing, I got to teach some of Western Civ in Deanna and locations around there for us for about 6 weeks, which was just wonderful. And I was active in the governance area. For a long time, I was, I think, chair of the, what was it called, Student Affairs. And we would sort of deal with different issues. One of my campaigns that was unsuccessful at OBU, however, was to get the students to adopt an honor system. Davidson is somewhat famous for having an honor system that the students run, and it's very simple: no lying, cheating, stealing, and then that can lead to suspension. And in fact, nowadays they actually send documents about this and have the students who are going to be freshmen sign off and their parents sign off on it. And it works. So much so that they'll have they'll have open areas for exams, for instance, and you can come when you want to and take your exam. And I think probably there's a proctor there somewhere, but it's a good system. And they had it. Excuse me. It's a kind of tradition at Davidson. And what I discovered is that it's very difficult to start something like that. And I tried. And basically, when we had some hearings in the student affairs at OBU, the juniors and the seniors, the ones getting ready to graduate, said, "Yeah, we need this." And the freshmen couldn't see it. Aren't we all Christian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. At any rate, my other activities involved faculty council, which is like our faculty senate that you may have it in Stillwater. And a couple of times I was chair of that, and I was active in governance kinds of things, committee to select a president, things of that kind. And then I participated in intramurals, and I probably have more tennis prize shirts than anybody else because I was active from the early 80s all the way through my career. So I was at it longer than most students could be. And I would always I always played doubles, and I would always select a very good student tennis player, and we would go out and have fun. And that was a lot of fun too, playing, just playing intramurals at that level. And I'm trying to think what else. There were, normal kinds of things going on. We sponsored some conferences there, and I was active in that. And whenever possible, I would, well, usually at least once a year, I'd present a paper somewhere. Sometimes I'll confess I would choose the conference by the city that it was in, which I wanted to visit. So San Antonio and Albuquerque became two favorite places to go for conferencing. And it was a regional popular culture conference that occurs regularly in Albuquerque. That became one of my favorite places. So I was fairly active in that, and then managed to get several national humanities sponsored summer seminars, which are set up for professors at four-year schools, which do not have a large research library available. And so it's a kind of renewal of one's academic skills, you might say, and under the tutelage of a major scholar at a large university. And so I got that, got a couple to UC Berkeley, which was quite enjoyable, and Milwaukee, Yale once, and so forth. And those were sponsored by again, the National Humanities. And And then there were some Mellon grants that were offered by Rice that I managed to get as well. So I had fairly active career, I guess, for someone whose major load is teaching. And that's basically how we're evaluated at a school like OBU. The teaching has to come first. Relationships with the students, relationship with your colleagues. The research is good if you're doing it, but it's it's not necessary to publish a book, for instance, to get tenure. So I guess that's a pretty good summary. And I began the working with Let's Talk About It while I was at OBU, and it fit quite well with what I was already doing, particularly emphasis on modern fiction, contemporary fiction.
Yeah, seems like a good time to move on to Oklahoma Humanities.
Okay.
So I wanted to ask you, like, when did you first become aware of Oklahoma Humanities as an organization?
Right. Well, that would be probably the first Let's Talk About It that I did with mostly with colleagues from OBU at the time, and that was the Not Just for Children series, which we mounted about 1985, I want to say, sometime around there in Shawnee, and that led then to other offerings if we wanted to be scholars for Let's Talk About It. And at the time, Jennifer Kidney was head of Let's Talk About It and traveled the state extensively, I think, building the program. In fact, she's probably the one mainly responsible for building the program and gathering up scholars and keeping in touch and that sort of thing. And that's where I first heard of it and became familiar with it. And then later, I became more aware of other programs that Oklahoma Humanities, now it's a council, of course, Oklahoma Humanities Council sponsors, and have worked with some of those as well. But mid 80s.
Okay. Yeah, and well, first, could you tell me what the Let's Talk About It program is?
Say that again, I'm sorry.
Could you tell me what the Let's Talk About It program is?
What it is?
Yeah, sort of what it all entails.
Yeah. Well, it's basically an adult book discussion program with many themes. I'm not quite sure how many now. It's got to be over 50 different themes in which the library applies for a grant and then puts up some of its own money to be able to bring in, depending on the number of books, 4 or 5 scholars. The task of the scholar is not to analyze and criticize the book so much as to present various aspects of the book and the author to an audience primarily of adults. I'd say primarily older adults, as it turns out, and then stand back and let the audience or the group discuss the book using, to some extent, the questions that the scholar has sent ahead of time. Some libraries prefer to have direct engagement of the scholar with the group, which is good as long as it's not a sort of question and answer thing. What did you think about this? They're asking me, because they're supposed to be the ones engaging the text. Other libraries, particularly if you draw a large enough crowd, will then break it up into groups, and they'll have group leaders, and some are quite good at that. In a way, it depends how many people show up, I guess you could say. The books are linked by the themes like survival, The Oklahoma Experience has several series books from by Oklahoma authors mostly. And there's some detective series and so forth. And the librarian will often, if she's got he or she has an active group, will often actually consult with the group and say, here are some different series that we might opt for. And sometimes they will participate in choosing what the series is. And finally, the success of the programs probably depends on the relationship between the organizing librarian and the group that shows up. And I know I'm going further than your question here, but I can't stop.
It's
fine. And to my mind, the most successful programs where a lot of people show up are built on a regular book discussion group that's already meeting, because it's tough to sort of gather people each time who may or may not know each other. So the best ones have people who are obviously very familiar with one another, are comfortable with one another. And sometimes they're also part of a Friends of the Library group, which is another way that these book discussions sometimes start. In fact, Friends of the Library often help fund the library's portion of the program. But at any rate, they seem to work very well interestingly, in smaller towns where, I don't want to oversell it, but you get the sense in small towns, thinking of Healdton here particularly, that this is sort of an event for the town. Healdton's a very small town. When I go there, before I even talk, they have a potluck meal, which which is unusual and very welcome, I might say. And then I'll talk to the group. And I get that sense that in small towns, it's almost a cultural event or something. In the large towns, it's more a matter of that relationship I talked about between the librarian and potential readers, or building on a book club. And interestingly, when I've done programs, I've gotten some of my smallest audiences in cities. And I don't know what the failure was. I think I can remember one in Oklahoma City where basically the people that put together the program, two of them showed up, and that was it. And it was kind of embarrassing for them. They said, well, do you really want to do it? I said, well, you're paying me, so I'm going to present this program to the two of you. and I did. And I don't know what happened there. They had posters up and everything, but just didn't have an organized group, I think, that could support the program. I hope the other programs are better. I think I was the first up, so maybe things got better as it went along. But at any rate, I see it as an essential cultural factor in creating readership, and encouraging people to read. And frankly, let's talk about it. Unlike classes, maybe like classes, don't always stick to the topic, and so you find yourself in the middle of a discussion of what's going on in town and so forth. I remember one town, we were reading a crime book, and they said, listen, we've got crimes that are better than this that happened in our own town. And they were rather proud of that. And or the woman from a small town in the middle of the state said at one point, we were reading a novel called Joe, about working class folks in Mississippi, and with some rather lurid stories, I must say. And she said, listen, I could put names of characters from town into this book, And then she told a couple of stories about the guy that swapped his wife for a pickup truck and so forth. So the discussions range, and in some ways, I think this, people are talking to each other, which seems to be something we worry about nowadays. And they have a common interest in the book, and a common interest in the town, and there's a sense in which these are, what should I say, um, forces that encourage civic discourse, quite frankly, and you get the idea that the town is probably better because of this group of people uh, that's who are willing to discuss things, and people of different political persuasions and so forth, but getting along. And so I see it as a profoundly beneficial to society to have a program like this.
Yeah, that's all great. So what has your role within the program primarily been?
Mainly presenter. I'll go in and lecture, if that's what you call it. I try not to go into lecture mode, but I'll go in and present remarks for half an hour, maybe 45 minutes. Try to keep it down to half an hour. I kind of fell in love while I was teaching at OBU with PowerPoints, and the original, I'm not sure what the program stance is on those now. Originally, they didn't really want major productions with PowerPoints, and certainly there are ways of making PowerPoints very boring. You've probably been to a few where they'll put up the outline and then just read the outline on the screen as if you can't read. Um, but what I do is use PowerPoints for pictures, and so I'll put a picture up there of the author and talk about the author's life. I may have an outline of the life, and then but I never just stick to the outline. And then sometimes I'll, if there's some interesting sidelights to the book, or maybe historical context, I'll put that up there. And for instance, for Diane Glancy's Pushing the Bear, which is about the Cherokee Trail of Tears trek, I'll put some of the factors up there, the Indian Removal Act and so forth, things of that kind with dates, so they can have this historical context. So I'll do some of that, and then usually my questions end up leading them to talk about characters. That's usually the easiest thing to talk about, and they'll be the kind of questions that some of which I might ask in the classroom, but let's talk about as much more about, did you like this character? Why? Could you get into this character? I mean, this is not exactly classroom vocabulary I'm using here, but you're dealing with readers who enjoy reading and who have probably had some kind of imaginative experience and sometimes strong reactions one way or the other. And the idea is to let them lay it out and engage in discussion with other people. I always, in my presentations, always present something of the writer's career, because I'm interested in encouraging them to read on if they like the author particularly, and what are some of the other books that the author's written they might want to follow up on. And so that's pretty much what I do. And then sometimes there's a wrap up where I'll wander, if they're doing groups, I'll wander around and sort of listen in on what the groups are doing, and then maybe have some final remarks, maybe summing up some of the things that the groups have reported on, or sometimes I'll add more information that I didn't put into the lecture. And for instance, in one detective story, there's a valuation of A is for alibi, the novel, and I'll indicate how much it's worth if they have a first edition signed by the author, because that comes up in the book. And I'm not going to pick at little details, but I can sometimes add some, what should we say, tidbits, trivial kinds of things at the end that help things. You know, that's usually it. And I'll talk to the librarian a little bit later. Sometimes ask how it went, what they thought, just to get some evaluation. And of course, they fill out evaluations of the presentation and of the discussion, which are then sent to the Oklahoma Humanities Council. So I imagine I have a file there. Not that I've seen it, but at any rate, my role, in other words, is to come in to sort of stimulate the discussion and maybe sometimes participate in it.
Yeah. I also saw that you had come up with some of the themes for Let's Talk About It programs. Is that correct?
I created two themes. One was the Oklahoma experience revisions, and the effort there was to bring in some contemporary authors to the mix. So Diane Glancy's Pushing the Bear, Rilla Askew's Fire and Beulah about the Tulsa race riot or massacre. Leanne Howe has a book in there. That was, I did that with Jennifer Kidney. She helped write that. And Billy Lett's Honk and Holler is also one of the books. And we, at the time, managed to bring all of them. Well, we didn't, I don't think we brought Billy Letts. She wasn't available, but we managed to bring all of them to a little book festival that we created in Shawnee called the Red Dirt Book Festival, which, by the way, was funded in part by Oklahoma Humanities. And so the authors were there, and it was a nice kickoff for the series. Then the other series I created was Oklahoma Investigations, and it featured basically mystery books, and it was fairly popular for a time. I'm not sure how popular it still is, but as I like to say, reading books about crime in New York City and LA, it occurs to me that we have enough crime in Oklahoma to make some interesting books. I've actually proposed another one called a true crime series, but they haven't been as interested in that, and recommended I find a lawyer organization to fund it if I, which I haven't done. But that would feature The Innocent Man, for instance, Grisham's thing about the Ada murder. And at any rate, in both cases, I sort of created the series and wrote up the essays for it. And they were mounted. And libraries that have been in the Let's Talk About It program for some time, of course, welcome new series. They're being created all the time, on food and Native American culture and so forth recently.
Yeah. So what kind of work had to go into making those themes?
A lot of reading. I did the crime series, for instance. There are a lot of Oklahoma writers creating mysteries, and I was lucky to. I read quite a bit. I spent probably months. But basically, I'm a fan of detective fiction anyway, so it was a lot of fun, basically. And Donis Casey's the Old Buzzard Had It Coming about Boynton, Oklahoma. She has a series there. Was a real find, and Sue Hoklitubby had begun one featuring a Native American. called American Cafe, I think was the first in the series. Um, and it turned out the series, the reading I did had to be scaled down because it turned out that most detective or crime titles don't say published. And even though I campaigned, Fred Harris, former senator from the state, has a couple of good ones featuring the west, set in the western part of the state, which I really wanted. But as it turns out, Oklahoma Humanities only wants books that are currently being published. Even though I located um, treasure troves of used books in various places, I said you can order these and you can have enough, but that didn't convince them. So, so at any rate, that was an enjoyable series to put together, basically, and um, uh, I, have continued reading that, reading on Carolyn Hart's Letter from Home, for instance, part of that series. And, she's probably our most famous Oklahoma author right now. Lives in Tulsa and is still writing. She's moved on to write a detective series that features a ghost, which are somewhat comic, I must say, but quite good. And the lawyer series set in Tulsa. William Bernhardt, who teaches at Rose State, lives in Midwest City, was another book in that series. But at any rate, it was quite enjoyable, and I ended up reading a number of titles by each author, trying to pick out which book would be the best after that. And then you have to write up the essays, write a sort of introductory essay that may or may not go into a pamphlet. Many of the series had pamphlets. I'm not sure they continue to do that, that are distributed then to the libraries and help the librarians figure out whether, which books or which series rather they're going to use. And in some cases, which books. It's possible to adopt a series and not use all the books. You just have to communicate that. But it's a rather enjoyable process, I must say. And starts with a lot of reading.
Yeah. What do you look for in a book when deciding if it should be part of one of these? Let's talk about it themes.
Okay. Well, for the Oklahoma Experience books, quite frankly, I was looking for books that focused on various areas and various periods of Oklahoma history. So, Pushing the Bear, we've got the 1830s in Oklahoma, and then Fire in Beulah, 1921. We're at the 100th anniversary, of course, of the race massacre. And then Leon Howe's book, Shell Shaker, is fairly modern, although it looks back at, through visions, in part, looks back at the heritage or the history of a particular tribe. And then Let's Honk and Holler opening soon is very much about the post-Vietnam era, and to some extent, with the Vietnamese character settling into a small town in Oklahoma and sort of finding himself, and also features a vet who's paraplegic, wheelchair bound, and how he's trying to run the cafe and has bouts of depression and work. And so Billy Letts used her experience, her classroom experience, actually at Southwest, where she taught classrooms with many Vietnamese refugees that had come after the war. Um, so that one, at any rate, was fairly recent. That's the recent one, I think, in the series. Um, that was the criteria there. For the crime ones, I really wanted quality titles which were not entirely plot driven, um, but actually got into the characters and got into the locales. For my money, by the way, detective fiction often carries on that realistic attention to environment, very much so. And because often the environment is a factor in solving the crime or creating the crime. And so I was interested in getting novels that were located in different parts of the state and didn't entirely succeed in that because, again, a number of them were out of print. But also ones that would get into the mindset of the detective, and in some cases, get into the mindset of the criminal, and so that there was a little bit of a psychological interest there. Um, and certainly in Donis Casey's series, which is set in Boynton, a town that almost doesn't exist anymore, she's very interested in the community itself and the interactions of people within the community when a crime is committed. She, by the way, the series starts in the early 1900s, and she's now extended the series book by book through the Spanish flu thing, and has a very good. One of her more recent books is very good on the impact of the Spanish flu on this small town. And of course, there's a murder. There has to be a murder for a detective story to be worth reading. Um, but so I tried again and again. I tried to select novels that went into some depth and weren't just whodunits. With characters you don't really care about one way or the other, that kind of thing.
Yeah. And so we have around 10 minutes until we reach an hour mark.
Okay.
So to sort of wrap things up, I just wanted to give you the floor to talk about anything about Oklahoma Humanities that you want to, or even just the humanities in general that you think is important.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I would go back to early remarks about how the humanities, I think, encourages people to relate to one another, to enter other lives through fiction and through engagement with each other as they react to the books. And Let's Talk About That series, I think, does that very well, and has actually, to my mind, encouraged libraries and library systems to set up book discussion groups. I know Anne in Shawnee, I think probably with no fewer than 4 separate book discussion groups started up. I started one, as a matter of fact, and just because you find it's not only fun to read the books, but it's fun to talk about them with other people who've read them as well. And I think that I really do believe that encourages um, civic participation, understanding of people with different views, um, helps build community, quite frankly. And sometimes humanities can do that also through book festivals. We had 3 of them here in Shawnee. I mentioned the one, 2003, which were funded by the state humanities as well as the Pioneer Library System. And those help bring in people who become familiar with new authors and buy their books, even when you're not sure that their books are going to be any good, but you want to encourage people to write. And I might say one of the things that happens often, and let's talk about it, particularly if you're dealing with a book that is close to the personal experience of the author, I'll usually pitch it and say, you guys have got some interesting stories here. Are you writing them down? Are you talking to the relatives of a previous generation? That's important too. Not that you're going to get published or anything, but just the writing this stuff down, self-publishing maybe, and people around you buy it and so forth. And I like to think that humanities programs then encourage people to go ahead and write and record these things so that future generations may benefit, and maybe the town becomes more aware of itself. That kind of thing. Generally, I think too, on the national level, the humanities folks help encourage professors and academics, even in community colleges, who may feel ground down by the same classes year after year after year, and gives them an opportunity. Summer programs do themselves and maybe find new interests. I know it helped keep me alive at times when I despaired over the pile of papers and that I was going to have to grade, and wondered whether I would go ahead and retire at some point. I didn't, by the way. I stayed teaching till I was 70. And because I basically enjoy it. But I think generally the humanities contribute to the foundations of our democracy, and we have to be informed. It depends on people being informed and having information at hand. And what better way to encourage that sort of thing than to get them to the library and get them talking to each other and get them reading books. And I think the Let's Talk About It programs again have encouraged libraries to reach out much more, and particularly in summer programs. I'm not sure whether Humanities funded this, but one of the best programs that I participated in briefly while it was in the state was one called Prime Time, which featured children's books. You give the book to the child, the family would show up with the child, they would have a meal, a very minimal meal, and there'd be two scholars. One of us would read the book, showing the pictures, and the other would sort of lead discussion. And the idea was to encourage parents to read to their children. So important. And it was quite successful. I believe it was created in New Orleans originally. And I think Humanities, I'm pretty sure Humanities helped fund that. It lasted about a year, then Katrina came along and that disrupted everything. But that was a very good one. And then library systems are sponsoring their own versions of Let's Talk About It. Pioneer System has linked into the Big Read program, which is a national program. And now they have their own Pioneer Read, featuring a book every year. So, I think it's a real nice ripple effect of these programs that the state funds.
Yeah, that's all great. Well, if you don't have anything else that you want to share, I think we've covered most everything that I wanted to.
Good.
Yeah. So
Okay.
thank you again for doing this with me today.
Sure.